want to read verses 1 through 4 to set the stage for our lesson today. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. Wow, there's so much that we don't have time to dive into on this. But I do want to start our lessons out of the book of Hebrews with this reading and hit some highlights today that will whet your appetite in reading the book of Hebrews and together as we walk through this particular journey. We don't know who actually is the author of the book of Hebrews. As early as the church father Origen, the comment was made, God only knows. Martin Luther sort of said that too, God only knows. It's unlike the other New Testament letters where that Paul or Peter or others identify themselves. So we don't know. And yet there's an interesting comment in chapter 2, I think it is. Look at chapter 2, verse 3. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And that's going to be a looming question for us through the study. But he goes, this salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. Now that's an interesting comment, because it sounds like that whoever wrote the book of Hebrews was also among those who physically was present and heard Jesus. That's interesting. That's as much as we know specifically. Except in chapter 13, toward the end, there's a reference to Brother Timothy. So again, could it be Paul? Well, from the earliest days of the church, most people didn't think it was Paul. Some did. But that doesn't really matter because whoever it was apparently walked with the Lord, knew Timothy. And as a result, this letter needs to be viewed from the perspective of whoever this author is, divinely inspired by the Spirit of God, is writing to some Christians who are, and we're going to talk about the condition of the Christians he's writing to, because this letter is very important. If we're not careful, we get caught up in all of the mystery of Hebrews, and we come back and we say, oh man, this is one of the most difficult books of the New Testament. It doesn't sound like it's got anything for me very much, so I'll go to another book for my devotional reading. and Hebrews sometimes is one of the last books that people will read in the New Testament for that reason. But in a Facebook posting this week, I indicated that one of the best ways of looking at the book of Hebrews is what the writer says it is. In chapter 13 of verse 22, he calls it my word of exhortation. So if we look at the whole book of Hebrews framed as a word of exhortation, which means he's trying to encourage them, to exhort them because of their situation, then it becomes a letter of encouragement. And we're going to look at ways in which the writer is specifically going to encourage them. Now, as you're reading through Hebrews, if you want to make notes of this as you run across, you might say, well, how can I pick up on where those exhortations are? If he says, this is my word of exhortation, how do I know that? One easy way is all the different verses where he starts off and he says, let us do so-and-so. So when you come across the phrase "let us," that is one of those exhortations, and I think there's 12 or 13 of them all through the book of Hebrews. And as we go through Hebrews, we're going to highlight those. And I want to keep a running list of what those exhortations are, and then specifically try to show the difference that those exhortations make for us today too. In fact, I am so convinced of the power of exhortation that this is why on occasions in my invitations at the end of my lessons, I love to use exhortation that says, well, let us do so and so based on the word of God. It's an exhortation. So whoever wrote the book of Hebrews is giving us a word of exhortation. Now, the theme for this series out of Hebrews is Jesus never changes. Like I said, I think Hebrews 13:8 will be the key verse for all of this. And so what we want to look at is that the purpose is to get beyond our chaotic, changing world and make sure that our faith is grounded in the very person of Christ. Let me give this observation. If you watch the evening news, do you think the purpose of the evening news is to help you stay grounded and mature as a person? Is that the purpose of the evening news? I get the impression that the more bizarre, the crazier, the more attention grabbing that they can put on the news. That's what they want to put on there. Well, sometimes, as you know, what we think of as news has a way of generating fear. Have you noticed that? And that sometimes, and Nancy and I have kind of made a commitment to this, we don't watch the evening news before we go to bed. We used to. But there's so many negative things that come out of that you don't want to feast your mind on it right before you go to sleep. At least I don't, you know. So what we need to think of in terms of looking to Jesus, who never changes, because we live in a changing world. And today, we're going to be looking at this paragraph, and it reminds us of who Jesus is and what God did through him. There's some very specific things that he did. The opening paragraph is some of the highest language in all of the New Testament about who Jesus is. One of the translations, the NIV doesn't quite do it this way, but I think it's the RSV, and there's another English translation that starts off, in many times and in various ways, God has spoken in the past to our fathers. So in other words, they put that adverbial phrase many times and in various ways at the very beginning, because that's really where it's at. So the emphasis is, okay, yeah, in many times and in many different ways, God did speak in the past to our fathers. And that's an interesting study too. If you look in the Old Testament, look at all the different times and in all the different ways that God spoke. Let me give you two examples. Moses approaches God, who speaks to him out of the burning bush. God spoke that way. Remember Balaam's donkey? God speaks to Balaam through the donkey. So there are many different times and many different ways that God speaks in the Old Testament. But in these last days, the days in which we're living, these are called the last days. In these last days, he has spoken to us, and some English translations pick up on this because I think it's kind of important. The NIV that I read says he spoke to us by his son. Well, literally, the pronoun his is not there. Literally, it is, he spoke to us by a son. And I think that's by design, because it leads us to say, okay, he spoke to us by a son. Well, who was that son? What was he about? And you can almost hear the Hebrew writer saying, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you about that son. And so what we find in just this little paragraph is 8 things spoken about this son that makes him uniquely Jesus. And when you look at these 8 things, you're like, Nobody else in human history ever could you say about them what you say about Jesus. He is unique. And the writer of the book of Hebrews wants to establish how unique Jesus is and how important it is for us to believe in him, hang on to him, build our life on him, because he is unchangeable. So who is the Son? Well, as you know, he says, to start off with, he's spoken to us by a Son. And I love this because it means that when God created human beings, he didn't leave us without a word. God spoke to us, and he has spoken to us. And he literally spoke, Jesus did, this Son, he literally spoke the will of God to man while on earth. And Jesus himself became God in the flesh. And we read of what God speaks through Jesus in the Gospels. And God loves, think about this, he made us and created us out of his love, but he also communicated to us and continues to communicate to us out of his love. And that's very important for us. So what has this Son done? Wow. I'm going to mention them and just briefly talk about it because we don't have time to delve deeply into each one, but we will try in the future to deal more in depth with some of them. He was appointed heir of all things. Now that's interesting. Because I think it goes along with, he was the agent through whom God created the world. He appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. It's literally, he made the ages. So in all of human creation and the world and everything, God used Jesus to do that. Now, what we don't know is what all Jesus did during the creation process. Bible never goes into that. It's just that he was present and participated in that. Because God appointed him heir of all things. He became author, creator with God of all things. This is a world when we as Christians, we recognize it was created by God. Now, we live in a day and time where there are people who try to say and try to present the case and live in such a way as if the world just kind of accidentally came into being and there's no divine being behind the beginning of the world. Well, the writer of the book of Hebrews is going to say at least twice in very powerful ways that this world was intentionally created by God. Later on in the book of Hebrews, he's going to say, out of nothing, God spoke the world into existence. And here in chapter 1, God spoke, but he spoke to our fathers in times past in many different ways. God speaking, that's a whole lesson in itself. Have you ever noticed in the Bible, when God speaks, something's going to happen? Now, it can be a blessing or it can be a curse, depending on how his covenant people live in relationship to him. And God's original voice, as recorded in Genesis, in the beginning, God said, what? Let there be light. And there was light. God's voice in Scripture, when God speaks, amazing things happen. And that's why we need to pay careful attention. When the writer of the book of Hebrews says God speaks to us now through his Son, oh, wow. So with God speaking through Jesus, his Son, God intends some very powerful things to happen. And that's with human beings, okay? So God appointed Jesus heir of all things. He was the agent through whom God created the world. He's also the radiance of God's glory. I want you to think about radiance. The idea of glory is radiance, bright shining light. So bright that it blinds you is the idea of radiance. He's the radiance of God's glory. It's fascinating when you read in the book of Revelation, there's a couple of images of not only God's throne, but also Jesus, who is the Lamb, that's described as brighter than the sun, and the radiance of God's glory. Now, something brighter than the sun is pretty bright, isn't it? So he is the radiance of God's glory, and he's the exact representation of God's being. It's not that Jesus is like God. The writer of the book of Hebrews goes one step further. Jesus is the stamp of God's character, the exact representation of God's being. When we look at Jesus, we see God. And that's why God sent Jesus to the world, so that there could be that connection. We could see who God is. Now, there's something else he says here that's amazing to me. And I don't know the fullest way to express it. Sustaining all things by his powerful word. Some people take that to mean that the world in which we know it, and the way everything works in creation, all the different laws of gravity and the laws of science and just everything that makes the world hold together, is not just some abstract force out there in the universe. Sustaining all things by his powerful word. Not only did he just create it, he sustains it. I want you to think about that. So that when we think of something just as simple as the moon going around the earth, and we think about the earth going around the sun and the planets in the universe, that didn't just happen. If I understand this from a biblical perspective, it is Christ sustaining all things by his powerful word that keeps the world and the universe going. Wow, you talk about, you see, this is amazing because it goes beyond the argument, well, did God create the world or not? And the writer of the Hebrews goes, well, I've got one even bigger than that. Guess what? He also created everything in the universe, everything that is, and not only that, he upholds everything and keeps it going by his powerful word. What other option is there? I find it fascinating that these particular things said about Jesus are being written to a group of Christians that are somewhat discouraged. They're being persecuted. We're going to talk about that quickly here in a moment. Everything that they're going through, he's going to start off, the writer's going to start off with affirming foundationally who Jesus is, what he did, and why it's so important to make sure that you believe in him in this world in which you're living that really is the source of a lot of problems. Notice he provided purification for sin. I started doing this right at the top of my head, and you probably can't see this, but where my Bible says Hebrew, I'm writing down all the verses that relate to the writer dealing with sin in the book of Hebrews. Man, there's sin everywhere in the book of Hebrews. And the impression you get when you back away from reading Hebrews is, wow, this thing called sin was a huge issue with God. And God dealt with sin in a very specific way. And he's going to start off by saying, you know, this Jesus that I want you to believe in, guess what he did? He made purification for sin. He cleansed you and he cleansed me from our sin. And what's also amazing is he's going to talk about the guilt and the shame that was dealt with that purification, so that we who claim to be Christians don't need to let past sin with its attendant guilt and shame be like a chain around our neck, so that it hinders our Christian living and our Christian witness. Or, you know, we get to thinking like, well, you know, my life has been so bad in the past, you know, nothing good I can do. Or how can God save a person like me? Well, guess what? Jesus came to this world to save a person like you and like me. There's no such thing as sin beyond the reach of Christ's sacrifice. And the writer's going to talk about that all through the book of Hebrews. Now, he also is going to talk about Jesus sat down at the right hand of God in heaven. And he's going to say he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. He uses the word majesty to talk about God. There's another place in chapter 3, and I think in chapter 8, there are a couple places that we're going to also see as we go through Hebrews, where Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. In Philippians 2, we find out he gave up his right to be at the right hand of God, came to this earth, became a servant, died, but then was raised, and he ascended back to heaven. He's at the right hand of God. And one of the things the writer of the book of Hebrews is going to insist is that while he's there right now at the right hand of God, he's involved in a ministry. I can remember years ago first coming across this in chapter 8 of Hebrews, and it radically changed my view of Jesus' ministry, because I thought, when I talk about Jesus' ministry, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John records his ministry, and that's it. No, that's only half of it. The other part is, in Hebrews 8, he talks about Jesus who still ministers on our behalf. He has a current ministry on our behalf, interceding, working for us on our behalf. Now, when it first sunk into my thick brain, that blew my mind. I'm like, you mean to tell me that Jesus raised, he made purification for my sins, but he's now seated at the right hand of God, currently ministering? Yes, he is. What a joy it is to know that. And what we're going to find in the book of Hebrews is another dimension of Jesus, and that is he was so divine and he was so human. And we're going to look at those places in Hebrews where the writer goes out of the way to talk about how human Jesus was and how we can identify with him and how he chose to identify with us so that we're not left out in the cold. Then he says, he is superior to the angels and he has a superior name. Now, next Sunday's lesson, we're going to look at the rest of chapter 1. It's all the way from verses 5 through 14, because that's a big, long section. And it raises the question, what about angels? Are angels part of the Christian life? What most New Testament scholars think, because of the way he addresses it here, and then it says a couple of things in chapter 2, and they're probably right. It sounds like that some of the Christians he's writing to had gotten to the point where they were worshiping angels instead of Jesus. Now that's interesting, isn't it? And so what the writer will do later on in chapter 1 is say, well, now let's look at the proper place of angels. And he's going to come away with a rhetorical question that's amazing. And I won't answer it for you, but when we come back next Sunday, I want you to have an answer to the question. Think about it this week. Look at the last verse in chapter 1. Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? That's his question. Now, the answer is either yes or no. So when you come back next Sunday, you have a yes or no for me, okay? Because rhetorical questions are worded in such a way that the author assumes just by asking the question, you know the answer, okay? So that's for next week. But what difference does the book of Hebrews make? We're talking about the relevance of this book. It certainly is not like the next one in the New Testament, the book of James. I can't tell you how many new Christians in small group settings and lessons and sermons I've preached through the years of the book of James. James is so practical. I would be hard put, I think, for a person who just becomes a Christian to sit down with them and work through the book of Hebrews. That would not be, I think, the place to go right then. Okay. And yet, according to chapter 6, he's writing to people who have been Christians long enough that he says, some of you ought to be teachers, but you've got need that I go back again and we cover the fundamental things of the faith. So apparently they hadn't even grown to where they can grasp some of those. But let's, I want to work through this real quick, and I may run this off next week for you just to have a copy, because I went through the book of Hebrews and kind of did detective work and looked at all the different places that are references to the condition of the readers. What were they going through that necessitated the writing of the book of Hebrews? And so I'm going to go real quick, and then we can maybe make this available to us. Some were in danger of neglecting their salvation and drifting away, and even neglecting to assemble. That's chapter 2, 1 through 3, and 10:25. Some were losing their confidence and their hope, 3:6. Some had a sinful, unbelieving heart where they were turning away from the living God, chapter 3:12. Some were being hardened by sin's deceitfulness, 3:13. And some were losing their hold on their firm conviction about Jesus, 3:14. There were those dealing with weaknesses and temptation, and they didn't have the confidence to approach God in prayer. That's 4:14 through 16. Enough time had passed that some of them should have been teachers, but they had not matured enough to even go forward. 5:11 through 14. Some apparently had fallen away, and that's his language, and were beyond the point of trying to get them back. Chapter 6, 4 through 8. He warns them against, and this is amazing because this is his language, chapter 6:12, he warns them against being spiritually lazy and sick. So do you know anyone that you might categorize, you know them? Spiritually, they're kind of lazy and sick. They had forgotten how Jesus truly met their needs. He says that in 7:26. In the earlier days of their Christian life, they had suffered intense persecution. And he said, sometimes in the past, you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. And you suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. Hebrews 10:32 through 34. Wouldn't you hate to be a Christian, and because people in the community knew you were a Christian, you started ripping off your property? Well, that's part of the persecution. Some exhibited lack of perseverance and were shrinking back and being destroyed. 10:39. Their Christian walk was hindered and entangled in sin. 12:1. They were growing weary and losing heart. 12:3. He says, in your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So it sounds like the heat's been cranked up, although they hadn't had to give their life yet. Spiritually, he describes them with the metaphor of, and I want you to think about this, weak arms and feeble knees. That's a description of them spiritually. They've got weak arms and feeble knees. They seem to be resisting acceptance of the Lord's discipline in their life. Hebrews 12, 4 through 11. And then strife, bitterness, sexual immorality, and godlessness were present in the congregation. 12:14 through 17. They needed to be reminded of the kind of worship that's acceptable to God. 12:18 through 29. That's a big long section. And finally, they were reminded to submit to and respect their spiritual leaders. And then when we get to chapter 13, in addition to the exhortations that say, let us, there's a ton of exhortations that are commands. You can have exhortations that are commands. And I say it like this, and we'll delve into this when we get into chapter 13. But as parents and grandparents, you may have had the blessing and the privilege years ago of sending your children off to summer camp. I want you to think how parents and grandparents do this. When you send them off, you have last minute instructions. Brush your teeth. Don't put on dirty underwear. Make sure you make up your bed. And you have all these different quick instructions. Mind your counselor. Don't get in a fight. Think these quick instructions that we give to children when we send them off. Those kind of commands are real quick exhortations. In chapter 13, there's a whole bunch of quick exhortations. And that's how he's going to end the book. But I'm amazed that when you go through the book of Hebrews, the condition of these Christians, a lot of them were just barely hanging on. They were barely hanging on. So how does the writer of the book of Hebrews try to encourage people who are barely hanging on? I've talked to a lot of people in my lifetime, barely hanging on. Some very difficult experiences for two ministers that I knew, because they went through what they did. They even came to the place where they, for all purposes, let go and weren't hanging on anymore. Two of them told me, well, because of what I went through and what the church was like, I'll never darken the doors of a church again. Can you imagine the minister saying that? But that's how devastating the experience was, and they got so discouraged, they turned loose. People get discouraged. I'm convinced that probably one of Satan's most effective tools against Christians, it has been for the beginning of the church, it's not necessarily getting you to do something wrong, okay? It's easier to get you discouraged to quit. And that's what the writer of the book of Hebrews is trying to do, to encourage these people that are barely hanging on for all these different reasons, and a lot of stuff going on that's wrong, shouldn't be going on, and he's trying to encourage them. One Christian writer, after talking about the book of Hebrews, said the central message of Hebrews is this, and I kind of like this. Jesus provides a superior basis for relating to God and enduring in that relationship and in the relationship with others. And those who reject God and reject Jesus, and as we said, quit hanging on, he said it this way. Those who reject him, they're in deep trouble. And the book of Hebrews is going to talk about toward the end of how deep trouble people are in when they turn loose and don't hang on anymore. So is the book of Hebrews relevant for us? It sure is. It has deep insights and wonderful words of encouragement. Foremost, Hebrews speaks to the challenge of persevering in the Christian life over against falling away from God. In a day when thousands every year abandon the church, either in overt rejection or quiet separation, the church needs to address the problem of what to do about it. Thousands worldwide are caught in the crucible of persecution, and they're tempted to quit the faith. I saw in the news this past week, 8 Christians, was it in Kenya, were beheaded. There are Christians all over the world. They're being persecuted for their faith. Right thinking about Christ leads to right living in hard times. I'm going to say that again. That's a wonderful insight from the book of Hebrews. Right thinking about Christ leads to right living in hard times. The right view of Christ and his superiority over any other religious system or any other option out there provides a foundation for perseverance. And the book of Hebrews challenges Christians to choose a path of drawing near to God and to the Christian community as the relational basis for endurance. And so the book of Hebrews, then, I want to offer to you is a rich depository of encouragement and spiritual nourishment when tapped into for our own guidance and our own spiritual resources. So if as a Christian community of faith, we can see Jesus more clearly, chapter 3:1 and 12:1 and 2, and we can draw near to God more consistently, 4:14 through 16 and chapter 10:19 through 23. And we can encourage one another more readily, 3:13 and 10:24 and 25. Hebrews will have served us well in addressing life's problems and putting us on the path to spiritual maturity. So this morning, are you ready to participate in the initial act of Christian baptism, where you can live a life in Jesus who doesn't change? May God instill in our hearts the joy of being able to participate in the life that embraces Jesus like this. And we're encouraged by that choice. So let us live in the fullest joy and embracing in the fullest way a vibrant and intimate relationship with the superior Jesus, who now sits on the right hand of God, ministering for each one of us. If you need to come to this Jesus, as we've talked about this morning, so that he can be your Savior, won't you come? We stand and sing the invitation hymn.